Okay, so Liz with Sew with Liz is back, and I showed you in the other video how to sew all your your binding strips together, and I did that, and I trimmed all the seams, and now what I'm doing at the ironing board is ironing my binding in half, wrong sides together, and that's folding it in half, of course, along the length of the binding. Now you will see that when we get to a join in the binding, I've got these little dog ears or cat ears peeping out, which was the seam at the diagonal. So when I reach those, I will trim them off, or I may do them at the end when I have finished all my ironing. So it's quite a long strip of binding, so I'm not going to make you sit and watch the whole thing. But this is quite an important part because you do want your binding not to be stretched, because it was probably, like here, cut on the crosswise grain. Now what that means is I cut the binding strips, and they were cut at 2.5 inches wide. All right, so that's 2.5 inches wide over there. I cut them from selvage to selvage, and that's the crosswise grain of the fabric. Now, if I bring this here and I pull it, do you see that it's got a little bit of give? Not as much give as you have on the bias, and generally speaking, we don't cut our binding strips on the bias of the fabric, which would be on the 45-degree angle of the fabric, because it really ends up being quite stretchy. The time you will need to have your binding strips cut on the bias is if you are making a quilt that does not have straight edges. In other words, perhaps you're making a circular quilt, or you're binding a circular table topper or circular wall hanging, then you will definitely need your binding strips to be cut on the bias, and you will have to be very careful with them. Take care with them that you don't stretch them, especially during this particular step where you are ironing the binding in half. And you can have different widths of binding. Generally, when I am making a quilt, I will cut my binding strips 2 inches wide. And I've got into the habit of doing that because most often I actually apply my binding to my quilt using a quilt binder attachment. In other words, I feed the fabric into a special attachment, and that then wraps around the edge of the quilt, and it folds the 2 edges of the binding in, and then my quilt is tucked in the middle. And then as you are moving your quilt along and the fold is forming, what it means is I'm just doing that all in one quick step. And that quilt binding attachment that I have requires 2-inch wide strips. Now, I'm not going to use that for this particular quilt because I don't have that quilt binder anymore. However, you can certainly use that, but you will have to stick to the binding width that your attachment requires. So what I've done now is I made my binding a little wider, so that I have got a little bit more of grey showing on the edge of my outer border on my quilt, which is a sort of dark denim blue. And whoops, that needs to be just pressed a little flatter there. All right, so there is also the option of cutting your binding strips on the length grain or the straight grain of your fabric. In other words, parallel to the selvage edge. Now, there are some people who prefer this because that means that if you have enough yardage of fabric, you will not need to have any joins in your binding. And I know that there are some people that prefer that, but in terms of being frugal, you actually will then need many, many more meters of fabric in order to cut your binding on the straight grain. And obviously you're not going to use the full width of the fabric for all your binding strips unless you're making a quilt that will hang down the side of the Empire State Building in New York. No, no, no. But you will then be left with a lot of yardage, but not the full width of the fabric. If you're okay with that, that is perfectly fine. If you're not okay with that, then you're probably going to opt for what I did, which was cutting on the cross grain from selvage to selvage. It's quite a lot more economical for your binding. And of course, there's all sorts of things. I will do videos at some stage where you include a piping or a grouting with your binding. That can give a very nice effect. And there is another one where if you have got a quilt top and the back of your quilt are very different colors, you can actually do a reversible binding. In other words, you join the binding and one side is one color and the other side. So you're going to join down the middle or somewhere down the binding. And I will do a video showing you how to do that in due course. So stay tuned. What I would suggest you do is follow my YouTube channel. And when you do that, you will get a message when I post a new video. You can, in other words, if you hit that bell, then you will be notified when there is a new video. It might not be for a little while because this quilt that I am making, and the binding is now my very last step in the quilt, that is going with me in a couple of weeks' time to London, UK, where my son and his family live, and the quilt is for my grandson. And I will be away for a number of weeks in the UK. So I obviously won't be posting any videos while I'm away, but I will for sure get going and do more videos for you and post them. And these are all free videos, and you are also most welcome to put comments below the video and tell me if you liked it, if you didn't like it, and if there's more topics that you would find useful for your quilting or your sewing. I do all aspects of sewing, not just quilting. So if you had a garment sewing question or a machine embroidery question, you could certainly put that there and say, you know, Liz, I'd love to see a video on how to insert a zipper. I do have videos coming for you shortly on zippers, how to insert zippers in little baggies. So there will be a series of those videos, so watch out for them. And all I can say at this stage is let me go and attach the binding to my grandson's quilt. See you again another time.